Welcome to the August 27 Management Case Study Exam Pre-Scene Analysis video from Astranti Financial Training. In this video I'm going to be going through the pre-scene in a very detailed way and giving you tips on how to pass your exam. My name is Richard Lewis. I'm a writer and a tutor here at Astranti. I began my career about 20 years ago as a business journalist, doing financial reporting mainly, and then became an industry analyst, briefing CEOs and chairmen on industry trends in consumer behaviour, in supply chain, marketing, IT and finance. And now I'm going to take you through this pack. So that's enough about me. Let's get right on into it. I've got the pack open here, and we're going to have a look first of all at the first page, which gives us the job description. Now, the idea behind the management case study exam is that you are going to answer questions in the exam as though you're actually working at the case company. So it says you're a financial manager with Aurora Automotive company, and you report to Jen Snyder, a senior financial manager, who in turn reports to the finance director. So you're in the finance department, you're working as a financial manager. Now what this tells us is that you are working at the management level, and your work is to support strategic decision making. So you won't be expected to make strategic decisions yourself as a management accountant, but you will be expected to provide information that supports strategic decision making. Now the next paragraph tells us how this is going to work. So it says your primary responsibilities are associated with management accounting. Management accounting is all about taking analysis to action. What you'll be asked to do, what you'll be expected to do, is pull together information that you've got from liaising with colleagues in the treasury and the financial reporting functions and all kinds of other functional areas such as sales, HR and operations. So you're expected to know the theory that goes with all of these areas. Then you're going to be discussing an issue. This means that your answers should always present the relevant theory applied to the case in hand, and it should discuss or weigh up the pros and cons of various courses of action. Let's say your manager is writing to you and saying, well, the CEO is considering an acquisition of this company, a supplier. Well, then your job would be to put out the theory about acquisitions of suppliers, about vertical integration, and to weigh up the pros and cons of doing that in the case of Aurora, because you work for Aurora. Okay, so it's not just abstract theory, it's about this particular company, and then make a recommendation based on your analysis of the situation. That's the MCS exam really in a nutshell. It's not enough to pull out theory and trot it out and say, okay, well, I've learned objectively this subject and this subject. That's what the objective exams are for. The case study exams are about how well you can apply this in an employment situation. It's really testing your employability in the marketplace as a management accountant. Can you take the theory and actually apply it to a work situation and do this job? Okay, so that's why we've got the job description. That's how to use it, and that's how to approach your exam questions. Okay, so with this preamble out of the way, we can move on to the next bit of the pre-scene. Now we're very lucky here because we've been given a very detailed breakdown of the automotive industry and how it works. So let's go through it point by point and see what we can pull out. The first point I'd like to make is right here in the first sentence. The industry has always been at the forefront of technological developments, both in manufacturing and in commercial business practices. So straight off the bat, we know that for our case company, Aurora, investment in research and development is going to be key. If they're operating in this industry, they need to be investing. So one of the first things you can do is have a check in the numbers and make sure they are actually doing that. We'll have a look at the numbers later on, not in this video. We want to be checking for outdated practices in the way that they go out and do business, anywhere where their rivals might have a competitive advantage through being more in tune with the times than Aurora is. We would want to make sure that Aurora is making proper use of automated manufacturing processes, so be on the lookout for any manufacturing process that's being done by hand where automation could actually provide a competitive advantage, an efficiency advantage. We also learn that the industry has led globalization in manufacturing and marketing, so we might expect to see Aurora having a rather distributed manufacturing base. We probably expect to see the company indulging in outsourcing, offshoring, nearshoring in order to get better labour costs, more efficient cost structure. That's something we would look for, and if we don't see it, then that's a recommendation that we can make. Okay, now the next paragraph talks about the history of manufacturing in the industry. So the start of the 20th century, then the manufacturing was dependent on skilled labour. As time has gone on, we've moved into production lines, which do not require a great deal of skill or training because the work's been broken down into a series of tasks like scientific management. And you'll remember from E1 that where you have a scientific management situation, there are some HR implications, notably heavy unionisation and union action. So this is just a little flag that tells us, hey, this is an environment in which you would expect to see unions quite strong, and there is a risk, of course, of union action if staff buy-in is not obtained for changes. And so we start now to get into stakeholder management, don't we? So if we get out our Mendelow's matrix, we can start to map the staff and the unions as separate stakeholders, and we can try and determine what level of power and interest they have, and therefore what sort of management approach should be taken to dealing with stakeholder demands and stakeholder conflicts. Now, in the next paragraph, we learn that more modern production methods reduce costs to a level where cars could be sold to the mass market, not just to a rich elite. And so the automotive industry grew to become a dominant economic force in many countries. Now, what do we know about a business that's a dominant economic force in a country? Well, it means there's likely to be high government interest. You've got something that's a major employer because you've got a lot of staff involved in production, but also accounts for significant export trade, and this is going to be of significant interest to governments. And so what you are doing is going to be subject to a heightened degree of scrutiny by government. Now, it could be a bad thing, but it could also be a very good thing, because if the government has a great interest in your welfare, then perhaps you're not likely or not as likely to fail in tough economic conditions as some other industries and some other companies might. So quite apart from having to map the government onto Mendelow's, apart from that aspect, governments can be a source of finance. Now, many industries don't have the opportunity of raising government finance. It's the banks or it's investors, private or public, and that's about it really, or selling off assets. But there's this other channel that's open to auto manufacturers, a bit like the film industry as well, where you've got something that's in the national interest, goes out into the world as export trade, and also sort of acts as a kind of logo for your country. When you think about VW representing Germany, or something like Peugeot or Renault representing France, these are companies in which the government are very, very interested, and so therefore there's this additional opportunity to raise finance if you're in a pinch. So if we move on to the next part of the page, it tells us early production lines were very efficient, but they were not very flexible. But by the end of the 20th century, we started to see a revolution taking place on three fronts. The first of these is the idea of modular component subsystems. This is where you've got specialist manufacturers which are building sub-assemblies, okay, so parts or assemblies of parts, such as engines, gearboxes, braking systems, electrical and steering systems, in their factories, and then the car maker is buying them in and assembling them all together. I worked in a place like this years and years ago that made the hinges that went on car seats. Okay, that's all they made, hinges for car seats, and then they sold these assemblies to car manufacturers. And it means Aurora doesn't have to make everything. So in the early days of car manufacture, car manufacturers pretty much made everything they needed to go into the car, which is obviously very, very labor intensive when you've got so many parts. However, these days what happens is that car manufacturers buy in assemblies from preferred suppliers and assemble them together, which is great. It allows for economies of scale. It allows for a manufacturer to buy in masses of parts, assemblies, and achieve cost efficiency. So that's a good thing. But of course, there's always a flip side to it, and that is if you're dependent on an external supplier for vital assemblies, then that's going to increase the bargaining power of those external suppliers. So then we're into Porter's five forces, and we have to look at the relative bargaining power of buyer versus supplier. Okay, what happens, for example, if the key supplier of gearbox assemblies suddenly gets a little cocky and thinks, okay, you know what, we're going to put the prices up by 20%. Well, what do you do then as Aurora? What can you do? Can you source from someone else? Can you negotiate? Do you have sufficient power yourself to negotiate prices downward? What happens if a supplier goes bust? Again, it's a similar situation. Can you get that sourced from somebody else? And what effect is that going to have on production? So you need to look at that whole range of issues there when it comes to these external suppliers. Now, the knock-on effect of this mode of modular production means that you're going to get this shift away from wholly national car manufacturers. It is going to be a more global industry. Instantly, you're going to be sourcing assemblies and parts from different countries, and so you don't have a purely Westland car. It's unlikely that Aurora is going to be a purely Westland manufactured vehicle. Now, what does that mean for us in terms of our analysis? Well, it means that we've got to widen our analytical scope and use Pestel to look out for the environmental factors that are going to affect our case company, not just in Westland, but in all the countries that it deals with, okay, in its supply chain. So it's not just a case of where it sells, but where it's sourcing from as well. What are the political, economical, social, technological, environmental and legal factors in every single one of the sourcing countries? Okay, so that's quite a significant piece of analysis that you'll have to do, depending obviously on the degree of internationalization at Aurora. Okay, so that's the first element, the idea of modular component subsystems and the ensuing internationalization. Now, the next element to come out of this was the idea of sharing components across multiple models and perhaps even multiple product groups. So if you think about it, the economies of scale that you can get there just kind of increased exponentially, didn't they? If, for example, you've got a small car, a medium-sized saloon and an SUV, but they all use the same basic gearbox, then you can really achieve some economies of scale because you're buying for 3 different product ranges, not just for one. So the opportunity is here to do some value chain analysis on Aurora and look for areas where they are perhaps not as efficient in rolling out common components across their product groups. Okay, this may also lead us to envisage some business process re-engineering. If it's determined that Aurora could in fact use a common component, then we may need to rethink some of the processes that they're currently involved in to allow for this. And so eventually you're going to get a much more efficient value chain. We're going to start removing non-value adding activities and putting in these common components. We're going to get economies of scale, but economies of efficiency too. Okay, that's the way we need to start thinking. Okay, so let's move on and we'll have a look at this last point here, Now, what this whole process of common components has actually allowed for is collaborations between different manufacturers. So here's a situation where you've got manufacturers who are ostensibly in competition with each other, agreeing nonetheless to collaborate on the development of some basic structural elements, and there may be some other elements as well, engines, gearboxes, for example. Okay, and then each manufacturer is going to design the bodywork itself to create a different vehicle, but based on the same basic design using common parts. So clearly there's massive economies of scale to be had by doing that, but the question arises, where now is the differentiation? If a Mercedes and a VW Beetle have basically got the same engine and basically are the same car with a different body grafted on the top, then, you know, what are we buying? Are we buying just a brand? Are we buying a design? Are we buying our own interpretation of what the brand stands for? Are we buying our own imagination? In an ecosystem where cars are kind of basically the same, that the actual nuts and bolts of building a car is the same, then we've got a situation where the brand becomes increasingly important, because increasingly that's what's going to sell the car. That's where that perceived value add is going to come from. And so we need to start asking ourselves, what is Aurora's brand strategy? What are they doing to take their message to the world? But what is that message as well? What does Aurora stand for? When I go out to choose a car, why am I going to be attracted to Aurora instead of something else? Okay. It then moves on to talk about the rise of robotics. So the key points here I've highlighted is the idea that the rise of robotics in production made it simpler for repetitive, mundane tasks to be automated. And not only was it easier to get them automated, but they did it better than humans. They did it with more precision than had actually been possible. And they give some examples. So the question we want to ask is, in terms of Aurora, when we go through and have a look more closely at that company, are they using humans anywhere where robots could be substituted? And if they are, then what do we need to do to actually get that process turned into reality? Clearly, we're going to have some human resourcing issues. We're going to need to get our Mendelow's matrix and see how we need to address our stakeholders. But beyond the obvious HR issues such as redundancies and how we approach that, we'd actually get into change management as well, wouldn't we? We'd be looking at models like Kotter's 8 steps as a way to get it done. We'd need to probably identify the type of change, whether it's revolutionary change or evolutionary change. We need to look at the cultural web to see how the various elements that make up culture at Aurora are going to be affected by the change. Okay, so something as simple as a sentence here, rise of robotics, actually opens up this Pandora's box, doesn't it, of all kinds of different issues. So there's the value chain issue of getting economies of scale from going robotic from human, but then all the human resource issues, the stakeholder issues, and the change management and cultural issues. What are you going to do when there is resistance to change? How are you going to manage it? Okay, so should a question come up that says, for example, dear financial manager, please will you get a report to me about the viability of automating X production line? Well, this is what you would need to start doing. You need to bring up all these issues, discuss them, weigh up how they would affect Aurora, not objectively, but how they would actually affect Aurora itself. And then when you've done that analysis, then make a recommendation. Should we move to robotics or should we stay with humans? That's the sort of thing that you're likely to be faced with in the exam, and that's the approach that you would take to it. Robots, it says, also offered much greater flexibility because theoretically you can program the robots to know and understand different types of processes and use different tools without having to stop them and reprogram and retool. Okay, so this is important because if you need to retool your robot and reprogram it every time you change model or change process, obviously that's going to slow down production, and there's a cost involved, not just in the time but in the actual parts that you need to add on. So using a fairly basic technology like radio frequency ID tags, RFID, you can actually tag vehicles as being one type or another, and then as they come through the kind of gate where they're scanned by the tagging machine, that then sends the cue to the robot to say, okay, you need to execute process B for this one, process A for that one. So that's actually quite an important point that's been made. If you find anywhere in the unseen part of the exam, or later on as we go through the pre-seen, anywhere where Aurora is having to retool and reprogram, then they're doing it wrong. So you can make that recommendation, can't you? Again, it can be used not just to make different types of car, but actually to give it different types of finish. So if you want to offer more customization options for customers and actually charge a major premium for that, if you've got a robot that can do it without any extra cost, then that's all profit, isn't it? Now, next we learn that the auto industry was an early adopter of advanced manufacturing techniques, including just-in-time, JIT. This is the process. Instead of making one and then hoping to sell it, you sell it first and then you make it. You basically manufacture on demand, and what you want to do is check Aurora is doing this. If they're not, then that's some easy marks there to discuss the benefits of JIT and make the recommendation that they move to it. Now, for just-in-time to work, in order for you to be able to manufacture on demand, then you need a robust demand forecasting system. So then you could use that to lead into a discussion of different forecasting techniques. You could lead into a discussion of MRP2 and its implementation and how it would benefit, how Aurora would benefit from resource planning. Obviously, we imagine that they're going to be doing this in some way or another, but perhaps there are areas where they could do more of it, or perhaps they haven't implemented it and it was an oversight, and this is something that you can recommend. There's a throwaway phrase, quality circles, there, but that's a callback to total quality management, isn't it, from E1? So you could go back and revise that and actually use some kind of JIT question to lead into a discussion of quality management. Perhaps it's appropriate for Aurora to use Kaizen in its factories. Perhaps it isn't. All right, so what I hope I'm beginning to do for you is build up a picture of how you can use various different situations that might come up in the unseen part of the exam to shoehorn in the wealth of knowledge that you have about the theory and then apply that to the case company. Just a throwaway thing can actually open up all kinds of different issues that could be discussed and could be appropriate or not in the case. All right, so let's move on and have a look at the next part of the pre-seen. This part of the page is all about the people that are still necessary in the automotive industry. Okay, so it goes through a list of the places where people need to be employed. Maintenance is one, so you're always going to need engineers to repair broken equipment. Still in production and control, it's going to be necessary sometimes to stop production lines and reconfigure them to produce different type of model. Now, we talked just previously about how robots can switch between different types. Okay, so look, this could be an area, if you find it in Aurora, where robots could actually help. However, this is an area where the auto industry clearly still employs people. You still need people for unanticipated events. What it says is that it's actually quicker to task people to do new roles than it is to program a machine to do it. Besides which, very magnanimously, they say that some tasks may benefit from a human input. Well, it's nice to know, isn't it, that we still count for something, but perhaps there are some tasks that require judgment that machines just really don't have. Okay. Similarly, complex tasks may actually require humans to do them, and the example that it gives is that if you've got sort of low volume niche sort of models or special customizations, actually it might be cheaper to get humans to do it than it would be to program all these different variations into a machine. And just jump down to the last paragraph here. It says the changes in the industry have not entirely been driven by changes in manufacturing. What it talks about here is some changes in global trade. So in the early part of the 20th century, in the early part really of the organised automotive industry, it was about making local cars for local people. Most industrialised countries had their own car making industries, and these cars were designed to meet the taste of locals. And so the exports were basically a case of finding places that didn't have cars and saying, would you like some cars, since you're not making any? And then what happened was that you got countries in Asia, manufacturers in Asia, starting to export much more aggressively, actually compete with local manufacturers in their home market, which is a fairly bold step unless you've got a competitive advantage over the importing nation. So that's a Porter's diamond question, isn't it, where you weigh up the competitive advantage of nations. So in the 70s and 80s, consumers became more willing to buy foreign cars. When I was a young lad, people still talked about foreign cars. No one really talks about it anymore. No one's really weighing up the difference between something that's local and something that's foreign. Today, most things are global, and people are not really that parochial when it comes to choosing a car. So that global market then paved the way for international acquisitions. So it became relevant and appropriate to think about acquiring a car manufacturer in another country and develop models of cars that could be sold around the world. So it's no longer a case of local cars for local people, but global cars for global people. And that, of course, allowed for more economies of scale. So you've got a single factory making all cars for a particular model, but those cars are being sold all over the world, and they're using parts sourced from all over the world. Okay. So we could even get into discussions of centralizing versus decentralizing in this issue for Aurora. We could get into offshoring, couldn't we, and the discussion about where are we going to make this and where are we going to declare our profits. If we've got an ecosystem where we're buying parts from subsidiaries of our own company that are based overseas for economic reasons, then we're into the thorny issue of transfer pricing, and that also brings up issues of tax, because it now theoretically becomes possible to repatriate profits to countries which have a lower rate of corporation tax by charging exorbitant transfer prices for things that you're buying from your own subsidiaries. Of course, that is a bit tricky when it comes to declaring your tax, because governments do tend to look out for that sort of thing and see it as an indicator of tax avoidance. So you need to be very careful really when you're deciding on transfer pricing. It also raises the spectre of currency risk, doesn't it? So if Aurora is trading in the Westland dollar, we need to know really how well the Westland dollar is doing against other currencies and what sort of risks we're going to be exposed to, and then what sort of hedging techniques we're going to be using. So that's it for this initial video. In the next video, I'm going to be going much more in depth about Aurora itself and leading up to an in-depth analysis of their numbers. Now, just before I go, let me remind you that this is not the end of it. We do offer a full range of support materials, including the study text and other course videos. We do the industry analysis, where we look at the real world industry that your case study is based on. We do mock exams around the case study exam, and we offer marking, feedback and masterclasses, all of which are covered by the Astranti Pass guarantee. So I'll see you in the next video.